almost every people in human history have had this story of the interaction between humanity and, call it, the other. Sometimes the little people, dwarves, elves, fairies. These, in one sense, these are just labels, and you can even expand it to say ghosts, spirits, gods, devils, angels, demons. We've always had this narrative of this kind of plethora of entities that we've interacted with. And again, is there something that's hardwired into us to just believe in these stories, or is there an original source?
Right now on Higher Journeys with Alexis Brooks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Higher Journeys with Alexis Brooks. I am, of course, your host, Alexis Brooks, and I'm so delighted to be back with you again this week with a brand new episode, a brand new guest, and a guest that we've been trying to get on this show for quite some time. You see him right in front of you, and he's no stranger to the things that we talk about. His name is Nick Pope, and he is here to chat to me. Is that how they say it in the UK? Not chat with, but chat to, Nick?
I think either is fine.
Well, Nick, welcome. Finally, at long last. It's been a couple of years since every time we see each other at an event, I'm like, Nick, can you do it? Can you do it? And why? He's running around with Ancient Aliens Live. He's doing Fox News. So I appreciate things kind of lulled a little bit, maybe, or no?
Yes, a little bit of a summer break. Ancient Aliens Live is paused until the fall. And so, the perfect time to come on your show. So thanks for having me, Alexis.
I'm delighted. And I know our audience will be too, especially with what we're about to delve into, Nick. That has to do with none other than the paranormal aspect to UAP. The paranormal aspect to UAP. Now, Nick, as I say, put those two words together, paranormal and UAP, there will be a camp that will say, well, heck yeah, isn't UAP, UFO, ET paranormal by default? I'm not going to answer that. I don't know if you can, but then there are others, particularly in our camp, that say, nuts and bolts. We just have some work to do. We have some things to figure out here. Let's start with this. There seems to have been, and seems to still be, a bit of a schism between the camp that considers this a very scientific endeavor, in other words, getting to the bottom of what this is all about, the secrecy and the government spin on this in terms of what's been going on to date, and another that says, no, we need to delve into the high strangeness of this first and foremost. Let's start with that. Give me your thoughts on how you feel about that schism and where you sit on this, on if there's a side that you sit on.
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right. There is this divide in the community between, as you say, the hard nuts and bolts science side of it and the more paranormal, sometimes spiritual, esoteric side. And at the outset, I should say one point about this is that there's no reason why one or the other side has to be correct. It may be that when we look at this, one of the things that the Office of the Director of National Intelligence said in a preliminary assessment on the phenomenon, which they published in June 2021, they said there's not likely to be a single neat solution to the UAP mystery. So all of the above might be correct. It may not be an either or, but I'm going to shamelessly steal, but I'll attribute it, a marvelous quote from a British UFO researcher called John Spencer, who's probably not as well known in the US as he was in the UK. But he always used to take issue with the fact that UFO books were in public libraries put into the paranormal section. And he said, well, look, if it's just some other civilization has evolved in the universe and they've developed viable interstellar travel and they're coming here, what's paranormal about that? It's no more paranormal than say an ocean sailing ship was in back in the day, or one of our space probes now. And I said to him, well, look, if it doesn't go into the paranormal section, where would you want to see these UFO books? And he thought for a minute and he said, transport. And so I thought it was rather, it was a funny remark, but I think it got to the heart of this schism.
Agreed. There's invariably crossover. I mean, look, I'm one who really advocates for the it's not this or that, but this and that theory. We have as humans this we live in this sort of polarizing this polarity that it's either up or down, good or bad, etc. And you're absolutely right. There's no singular definition, no singular purpose, and no singular reason why we should know what the heck is going on. So thank you for sharing that. I love
Yeah,
that.
I'd like to qualify that with one more point, which is, I think, related. The reason why we hear so much maybe about the nuts and bolts side of it, and maybe less about the paranormal side, is that with the recent congressional engagement that we've had on UAP, there is no way that most of the congressional representatives, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, doesn't matter, but there's no way that they're going to go with the paranormal side of this. So when you hear people talk about it in the Senate or the House, and whether it's the armed services committees, the intelligence committees, the oversight committees, they will talk about it because they can frame it as a defense, national security, and safety of flight issue. And that's relatively safe ground for them. Because if the point is, look, there's something in our airspace, is it China, is it Russia, or is it something else? That's a fairly safe point of view that very few people would dispute. Well, yeah, it stands to reason. Look, pilots see them, they're tracked on radar, filmed on forward-looking infrared. Of course we'd want to know what they are. And so it's deliberately framed in a very nuts and bolts way. And I think it would be a very brave congressional representative to take it down the other route. So that has somewhat skewed the debate very much in favor of this hard scientific nuts and bolts craft, as opposed to paranormal phenomena approach.
I'm with you 100%, except I have to, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up, I don't know which of the hearings in the House Oversight Committee where it came up. I believe it was Representative Luna who intimated that this may be an interdimensional phenomenon.
That's true, yes.
That's not nuts and bolts.
That's, I guess I'd say, I'd still characterize that as a minority report, because when you put that up against all the other congressional representatives who've gone on the record here, whether it's people like Kirsten Gillibrand, Marco Rubio, Mark Warner, Mark Walker, I think Representative Luna is a minority report. Actually, though, I'll double it and say Tim Burchett has kind of come in with that view as well, and flirted with the idea that maybe some of this, and we've heard Tucker Carlson, of course, talk about this, not a congressional representative, of course, but former Fox News host and media pundit. We've heard him talk about possible spiritual aspects to this. But again, I think congressional representatives are on safer ground when they raise it as a straightforward defense issue.
No question about it. I mean, look, we're all trying to make up for many, many years of heavy giggle factor, just relegated to the annals of science fiction, et cetera. And now, in a very relatively short period of time, look where we've come. The giggle factor has diminished greatly, if mostly, and we're having hearings about this ongoing. And I want to get into that a little bit more. I want to get a little nuts and bolts into what your thoughts are on what may be next. But I think this would be a good segue, Nick, to bring up a recent article that just came out from Newsweek entitled "Aliens May Already Live on Earth, Harvard Researchers Say." Now, these researchers were from a program I had never heard of called the Human Flourishing Program. And they published a paper, which interestingly, it hasn't been peer reviewed yet. And interestingly, it's since been taken down, which I find interesting. But I want to read a couple of quotes and have you weigh in on this. So it starts out by saying the research paper, which is yet to be peer reviewed, suggests that life forms from other worlds could be living underground, on Earth, or within the moon, and that UFOs and other unidentified anomalous phenomena, UAP, may be evidence of them getting around. Now, bear with me, guys, because I want to go on. This is the key. Later in the article, it says, there is also a third minority class of hypothesis, an unconventional terrestrial explanation outside the prevailing consensus view of the universe. They wrote, This is, quote, this is the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, which includes as a subset the crypto-terrestrial hypothesis, namely the notion that UAP may reflect activities of intelligent beings concealed in stealth here on Earth, e.g. underground, and or its near environs, e.g. the moon, and or even walking amongst us, passing as humans. I know I gave you all a mouthful there. I'll have a link to the article where you can read it, but thoughts on that? You want to talk about deviating from the nuts and bolts and going to the possibly heart of the matter. What were your thoughts on this article?
Well, when I read it, I was very interested and pleased to see it. But I think it is worth making the point. They weren't claiming to have found hard evidence of this and saying this is what we've discovered. Here are the data. What they were really doing, I would characterize this more as a thought experiment. That what they were saying was, look, normally when we discuss UAP, we have a very binary debate about it, with some people saying it's all just misidentifications, and with, I call them the believer faction, saying, I think it's extraterrestrial. And what these Harvard academics were doing was really, as I say, a thought experiment, saying, let's get away from that, is it A or is it B, and say, well, what about C, D, and E, and maybe even F, and throwing some other ideas out there: ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, crypto-terrestrial hypothesis, time travelers from the future, just really to try and kickstart a debate within the academic community. And it's interesting, the group that put this out, they're a blend, they're an interesting mix of academics who specialize in theology, but also in philosophy. So it really is the perfect breeding ground for this, as I say, thought experiment. And it did a perfect job, because my goodness, yes, it made news headlines all around the world. And the fact that we're talking about it now proves that it's been successful in its aim, which was to kickstart a conversation on this.
Absolutely. Well, I follow you, Nick, in terms of being a thought experiment. I mean, look, so many of us, that's really all we're doing. We can only speculate and put some thought into it. But just to play just a teeny bit of devil's advocate, thought without any context is where, or a thought experiment without any context, or something that a dot connecting exercise that might lead you to hypothesize C, D, E, and F as evidential of something that could really be going on. I mean, couldn't we argue that there was something that led them? I mean, let me go on. So it says within the hypothesis, they mention aliens or humans from the future, and I definitely want to get into that. And get this, magical crypto-terrestrials akin to earthbound angels, which the researchers compare to fairies, elves, and nymphs. Now, I know you said there's philosophers in there, so we can see where those mythologies may have come in, but comment a little bit further on that.
Sure. Well, I think in response to your question about where this comes from, and are there any pieces of more tangible information that would lead to this thought experiment being done, I think it's twofold. Firstly, the physical presence of UAP in our airspace, as evidenced by satellite data, radar data, forward-looking infrared data, and the eyewitness testimonies from pilots and radar operators, and from intelligence community and military personnel who've had some involvement in this subject. So there are some fairly good data points there for the physical reality of something in our airspace. Now, I think where this bridges to this Harvard thought experiment is the cross-cultural nature of these stories throughout human history. And you mentioned, I guess, the mythology, the folklore. It is remarkably cross-cultural, that almost every people in human history have had this story of the interaction between humanity and, call it, the others. Sometimes the little people, dwarves, elves, fairies. These, in one sense, these are just labels, and you can even expand it to say ghosts, spirits, gods, devils, angels, demons. We've always had this narrative of this kind of plethora of entities that we've interacted with. And again, is there something that's hardwired into us to just believe in these stories, or is there an original source? And again, that's, I think, one of the reasons why this paper was written, to say what is the source for these remarkably cross-cultural stories, narratives that we have.
Why do you think they took it down? They did.
I don't know about that. I mean, maybe the Harvard authorities, I mean, obviously they have all sorts of political problems right now with protests and free speech and academic freedom issues. So it's not an easy time for the university anyway. But I think this paper, Harvard, we know years before all this, professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, Professor John Mack, was very much somebody who fell foul of the administrators at Harvard for his work on alien abduction. So that may be a factor. Of course, Harvard already has Professor Avi Loeb, the astrophysicist who is doing such sterling work with the Galileo project and as a thought leader on UAP. So maybe some people at Harvard were a little bit nervous and thinking we don't want to be in the spotlight. But on the other hand, I don't want to say that. Yes, I don't want to say that as a certainty, because sometimes these online pre-publication sites, they put something up, then something gets peer reviewed. If that process is going on, they may not want to bias it by having I don't know. So I don't necessarily read too much into that, to be honest.
Right. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. We can only speculate. I just found it quite interesting and not necessarily surprising, although it said that you can access the paper using Internet Archive, so we can find it if absolutely necessary.
Yes. So if they were that determined to censor it, they would ensure that it wasn't searchable by the Wayback Machine.
Right. Well, invariably, and I'm sure they had a heads up that Newsweek was doing this treatment on it. That and if it got to got all the attention that we think it did, there are going to be a lot of people that are going to be looking for this paper. So we'll leave that there for now. But there were so many other nuggets from this article, Nick, that that could be jumping off points for discussion. Not the least of which is, are aliens, quote air quotes, are they walking among us? I wanted to take a little bit of time on that because, I don't know if you know, but my audience and a lot of the work that I do as a researcher in this field is really based on the experiential aspect. I'm more on the evidential side in terms of anecdote versus the nuts and bolts. I always say, we got plenty of lights in the sky. And I know there's a lot of layers to that, but that's my bailiwick. So that part of the article really piqued my interest in terms of where that may have come from. So I thought I would take a few minutes to talk about this idea of the possibility that what we call non-human intelligence, I say NHI, have perhaps been walking amongst us for many years. I mean, let's go back to the late now Robert Dean, former Command Sergeant Major, who I think Project Camelot made quite popular in his admissions, and where he said emphatically that he had intel that let him know that they are likely walking in the halls of the Pentagon. Thoughts on that?
Well, sure. I mean, without wanting to trivialize any of this, of course, it's also worth mentioning that this is a standard trope in a lot of great science fiction, whether it's the old 60s serial The Invaders, or whether it's something more recent like the cult movie They Live. But you also find it absolutely in the UFO narrative. You find it with the idea of Valiant Thor and Stranger at the Pentagon. The idea that there's been this kind of visitation, and you sort of almost as an intellectual exercise can figure that any civilization sufficiently advanced to have mastered viable interstellar travel, probably, it's not too far beyond them to figure out a way to operate here without being seen. Whether that's just really effective camouflage. We, maybe call it invisibility or whatever it is. I mean,
Hmm.
you'll have seen, I'm sure, some of the articles that come up from time to time in the sort of military and scientific journals to suggest that we're much further along in developing genuine, almost like Harry Potter, optical invisibility than many people realize. And the technology doubtless runs 10, 15, 20 years ahead of anything that's publicly declared in almost any field, particularly those things with military applications.
Hmm.
So I in this kind of subject, one thing that I've always learned is never rule anything out.
Can't. Absolutely can't. Wow, talking about optical invisibility, that could take us down a whole other rabbit hole when it comes to the metaphysical side of this. And look, I know there's some great researchers out there, some like Caroline Corey, who did a fabulous documentary, one of several, called Superhuman, in which she touched on that, interviewed, I believe it was in that movie, don't quote me, but where she touched on this possibility of literally through a metaphysical process, through more of an alchemical process, even individuals that have been able to not be detected walking down a street. That's been covered in more esoteric circles. So certainly if there's a technology that's been derived from that, it wouldn't surprise me at all.
It
But
wouldn't
I'm
surprise me. And the Pentagon, of course, sorry to interrupt, but I
oh
just think
no.
it's very important because I know a lot of people are skeptical on this and say, oh, yeah, but that's just metaphysics and scientists wouldn't look at this. Absolutely, they would, and they are. And if people look at the 38 scientific and technical papers that were produced under the ORSAP contract, which was the contractual side of the Pentagon's ATIP program. I mean, those papers literally cover anti-gravity, invisibility, wormholes, warp drive, those sorts of things. So there's this interesting mix, I guess, that sure, there's metaphysics in the mix, but theoretical physicists are looking at this and publishing on it too.
Absolutely. Yes. Oh, we have come a long way. When you think about that, you're absolutely right. I want to stick with this idea, though, Nick, of let's just play with this hypothesis for a minute that we are not only not alone, never have been, perhaps, but that some of these entities, these beings, have the ability to cloak themselves in a human avatar and walk amongst us. Now, look, there have been stories told. In fact, I know our mutual colleague and friend, Richard Dolan, some of you in the audience may have heard the interview I did with him years ago. I think I was one of the first people he gave the interview to, about people that had given him stories of which they felt they were in the presence of something non-human in human form. And it's quite intriguing. But here's a common denominator that will kind of segue us into more of the paranormal aspect, and that has to do with telepathy and the telepathic link that will often be reported between witnesses and the others, if you will. That's been talked about a lot. Have you looked into that or had conversations about this telepathic idea between beings and humans?
I haven't, but well, I say that it's come up in some of the cases that I've looked into, but I don't really have the expertise in areas such as neuroscience to probe what the mechanism might be for something like that to work. That said, just by one of these spooky, or maybe not, little pieces of synchronicity, just literally minutes before I came on to do this interview with you, I saw that the DeBrief had published a story talking about CERN having made a discovery about this so-called, what Einstein called spooky action at a distance.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, people have often speculated that that process, whatever that process might be, and I have no idea. And I'm always reminded when Avi Loeb points out that we know 95% of the universe is made of dark matter and dark energy, and we know virtually nothing about either of those two things. So in a sense, as he always points out, we know virtually nothing about most of the universe.
Absolutely.
So I haven't read this article yet, but again, I'm sure there are dots to be joined here. in terms of
Absolutely.
what this process might be.
What the process might be, and the fact that it is quantifiable literally under the quantum mechanics model. I mean, spooky action at a distance is essentially the non-locality idea that which links to this ability to remote view all of these things happening remotely. Telepathy would be considered I'm giving it kind of a crude distillation, but it would be this idea of thought transfer without any distance being a variable. So, but the bottom line is, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it is possible. And a lot of people have argued what telepathy actually is. Is it mind to mind communication, or something even more complex? But the bottom line is, a lot of these witnesses that have said they've had encounters with non-human intelligence, human or otherwise, all talk about this telepathic communication that's going on from both ends. Not just being, thoughts being put into the human's mind, but them being able to have a two-way dialogue via thought, which really questions our capability, Nick.
It does, and maybe the answer to this is, look, it's not metaphysics; it's just physics. I mean, people always say things like, "Oh, well, this isn't allowed," faster than light travel, that sort of thing, because it's contrary to the laws of physics. And I always say, well, wait a minute, you're forgetting the end of the sentence. The end of the sentence is the laws of physics as currently understood. And our history shows us that our understanding of the laws of physics changes all the time, as I'm sure. I mean, I just mentioned the fact that we know virtually nothing about 95% of what makes up the observable universe.
Absolutely.
So what other discoveries are there? And I think Lou Elizondo said this or something like this in an interview recently. He said he doesn't like the term paranormal. It may just be normal, but a normal that we don't yet understand fully.
A misnomer. Absolutely. I would agree. Well, look, in terms of what we're privy to, whether by our own makeup, the way we've been designed, or by our own ignorance, we understand little, and we virtually see little. I mean, look, when you take a look at the visible spectrum of light, we see that much of it. I believe it's wavelengths of between 300 and 700 nanometers, which is teeny. Animals see more than
Sure.
that. So just by taking that fact, and that is a fact, we can only surmise what we're missing here, not just by what we're observing, but by the things that we potentially have the ability to do but can't do yet, at least as a mainstream, as a norm. If you're enjoying this episode, along with all of the subjects that we cover here on Higher Journeys, then I invite you to join our members-only community on Patreon, where we go even deeper into the conversations with the guests that you know and love. Not only does your membership ensure that we can keep this work going and growing, but you'll also get immediate access to our exclusive after shows. Get up close and personal with the guests of the show, along with many other member perks. So click on the link below to join now, or visit higherjourneys.com, where you'll find the Patreon link. We'll see you on the journey. Thanks.
Same with all the other senses too. We can only hear a tiny range of sounds, and of course, all sorts of other animals can pick up sounds that we can't. Same with smells. All the senses.
Do you think, Nick, now let's take this a little philosophical. This is a great conversation. Do you think that the lack of full capability, let's assume, of the senses, is it atrophied? Did something happen to atrophy? I mean, you're talking virtually every sense that we have. Never mind beyond the five senses. Was there an atrophying? Did something go into dormancy somehow?
I don't know about that, but I'll flip the question around and say that there's a Ministry of Defense study that attempts to project forward around 30 years in time and say, what might the world be like in 30 years' time? It's called the Global Strategic Trends Program. And some of the reports have been published on the Ministry of Defense website. And it's remarkable because, firstly, going back to the question about entities walking among us, one of the things it predicted is that by 2035, 2040, we might have a perfect humaniform robot capable of walking among us with nobody being able to tell whether it was an actual human being or a robot. And one of the other things that it talked about was enhancement of, so I don't know about the atrophy point, but one of the things that people are thinking about is enhancing the human senses, particularly with relation to things like the human eye. I mean, at the moment, for example, we can use eyeglasses to correct vision, and sometimes we can use LASIK and techniques like that, surgical techniques. But what if we could enhance the human eye so that it saw not just in the visible spectrum, but in infrared, in other spectrums? What if we could do that? And so there are some very interesting, and I know this gets into areas of transhumanism, which might be outside the scope of this conversation, but it is a conversation that people are having.
No question about it. Indeed. And it may be out of the scope of this particular conversation, but nothing is off the table here. We've talked about transhumanism, believe me. And of course, there's an big ethical debate going on insofar as this is concerned. There are a lot of people that still don't even know what transhumanism is in the mainstream, which I find interesting. But this is a great, thank you for this, Nick. Great opportunity to remind you, we're going to the after show, but guess what we're going to be talking about, everyone? We're going to get into a little bit deeper on the AI question in terms of sentient AI. Can or is there some advanced technology we're not privy to yet that may deem some form of AI sentient, as well as sentient craft? So join us on the after show. Come on over. By the way, I gotta digress a little bit. We just surpassed 100 shows. We have 100 after shows now in our membership, Nick, and you'll be our 101st. So come on over and join us over there. Patreon's a great community, and we'll talk more about that later. But that's what we're gonna go deeper on that. We're gonna go deep. Let's get paranormal. Let's get even more paranormal. I think all of this would be deemed paranormal as a misnomer, right? I tend to agree with Lou Elizondo on that. I actually have a chapter in my book, Conscious Musings, where I said paranormal is the new normal, and yet it may be a misnomer, not yet understood. Let's talk about Skinwalker. You want to talk about the most paranormal and UFO hotspot on the face of the planet that we know of. I'm still not convinced that's the only one to that degree. Have you been there? Have you been to Skinwalker Ranch?
I have not, but I know Dr. Travis Taylor quite well. For a while, of course, he toured with us on Ancient Aliens Live. Then his commitments at Skinwalker, amongst other commitments, meant that he wasn't able to continue with that. But of course, he's a colleague and a friend. And when he tells me about some of the things going on there, I'm very, very interested, of course, and I'm following the whole thing with interest, and I'm sure I will go there at some stage. And
you do want you will. So that was my next question. Would you go?
Oh, absolutely.
Really?
I'm a seeker of knowledge, I guess, knowledge and experiences. So that would definitely be on the bucket list.
That's interesting. You should say that. You are. I have a new level of respect for you, Mr. Pope, because I know that I wouldn't set foot there. And I know our mutual friend and colleague Whitley said he wouldn't either.
All right. Well, people make their own, people have to decide their own comfort level for this sort of thing.
Travis Taylor, whom I know as well, we all had the pleasure of sharing the stage at Alien Con back when there was Alien Con about a year and a half ago. He's an interesting confluence when it comes to this connection between the strictly scientific and the anecdotal and experiential. What you just said, he's spent many hours at Skinwalker and apparently has had many stories to share with you of the otherworldly. Would you be able to maybe tell us a little bit, and if it's encroaching on anything private, please don't, but anything that he shared with you that you might be able to share with us about his own experience there?
I think I'm going to have to err on the side of caution because I
Okay.
don't know what is in the public domain with this
Mm.
yet, and what has yet to be revealed. So for people who watch the TV show, I don't want to inadvertently put out any spoilers.
Fair enough.
And
Fair
and
enough.
also, of course, Travis is still somebody who is involved in government work through various contracts and things. For a while, I know he was at Radiance Technologies, and again, what I mean, you will know this, but what isn't widespread knowledge is that when Jay Stratton was director of the DoD's UAP task force, he actually brought Travis Taylor in to be chief scientist
Hmm.
on that. So Travis has a foot in both camps with this, but it gives me a perfect opportunity to circle back on something you said earlier in the show, which is a point that I often reinforce. People say, well, there's hard data and then there's just stories. And I always say, well, don't, to the skeptics, I say, don't dismiss the stories,
Mhm.
as you put it, out of hand. And here's why. Because I often remind people that Elizabeth and I watch a lot of true crime shows. And even in this era of forensics, DNA analysis, closed circuit television cameras everywhere, with all of that high tech side of things, it's still eyewitness testimony. In other words, people's stories
Mhm.
that lie at the heart of the criminal justice system. And every day in the United States, people are either convicted or acquitted because a jury has sat down in a jury room and discussed it amongst 12 individuals and said, does that story sound credible to me? Now, physical evidence may be a part of that equation, but at the end of the day, let's not kid ourselves. People's stories, their accounts that they relay, whether
Mhm.
it's in a courtroom, in my analogy, or whether it's to a TV show on the paranormal, those stories lie at the heart of both the criminal justice system and everyone's everyday experiences.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. As a matter of fact, I'm reminded, being married to an attorney, and I hope I'm getting this right. Isn't there something that's called Watley's Law that sort of touches? I think it's called Watley's Law. Correct me, journeyers, if I'm wrong. I'll look it up and put it in post. That basically says that if, based on a set of data that's anecdotal, if enough of the anecdotes measure up and essentially tell the same story, then it can in effect become law. It becomes a fact. Watley's Law.
Right.
Um,
I'm not familiar with that term. And of course, there are different, as you know, burdens of proof. Is it beyond reasonable doubt,
mhm,
or is it on the preponderance of evidence?
mhm. Yeah. Well, lots of questions. Again, I'm going to just add, look, and I say this to everyone watching and listening, as we dare explore these amazing mysteries. Humility, I say, is a universal mandate, Nick. We have to be okay with what we don't know and stay open. I think we truly run into a danger zone once we start to make edicts that we clearly just don't know to be true. We don't know. Let's just stay open and skeptical for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, I've seen that kind of dogmatism from both skeptics and believers in the UFO community, and it
Mm,
never ceases to amaze me. Sometimes at both ends of the belief spectrum, the true believers and the diehard debunkers, there's more of a sort of finger wagging certainty than I have ever seen, for example, in government. Those of us who've looked at this from inside government, we often say to ourselves, I don't know. And
yeah.
very often I listen to the people who say, I don't know, more than I listen to the people who have an opinion on just about absolutely everything.
That's why I like you, Nick Pope. You're preaching to the choir. That's how I feel. That's exactly how I feel. As a matter of fact, when we're considered You certainly are very, very learned in your field and considered an expert. I'm considered somewhat of an expert in this field broadly. And I always say, I was actually talking to one of our, we both take up a little space on the History Channel, to my EP at the time, Miguel Sancho, when he said, well, you're an expert in the field. I said, Miguel, there's no such thing as an expert in this field. There's no such thing, not really. So again, I just feel like the humility factor has to come in for all of us to an extent. And I agree. Be okay with saying, I don't know, because that's probably the answer that I give to most of the questions I get. I'd love to know, but I don't. I'd love to know that I don't. Listen, I want to talk about Jim Penniston and Rendlesham Forest, because you were integral in putting out, I believe it's a best-selling book called Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, the inside story of the world's best documented UFO incident, along with Jim Penniston himself and John Burroughs. Fascinating. And this is going to stay, guys, on the paranormal, because I believe that this very, very lucid account, particularly Jim Penniston, would fall into that high strangeness category. I've got a couple of visuals I want to show you, but I want to just jump ahead a little bit and talk about his encounter. Have you talk about the encounter with the triangular craft, finding the symbols on this craft, raised symbols, and the download that he received. Bear with me, guys, because there's something that I saw you talk about, Nick, on one of our History Channel shows, having to do with the zeros and ones. As a matter of fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm playing with this. Is the first time I'm doing slides on the show. I'm going to show you. Let's take a look at this. You know that image, Nick, don't you? Tell us about what
Yes.
we're looking at there.
Sure. When Jim Penniston encountered this UFO, after all of this, a few days later, he was at home and he received what he could only recall as a compulsion. He'd had, when he touched the side of this thing, he had a sort of jolt, and he's later almost described it as a telepathic download, but he certainly didn't use that language at the time. He just kicked himself for being, as he put it, too dumb to know better. He sort of laughed at himself afterwards that he shouldn't have touched it. But he received this almost like compulsion. He wrote down in his police notebook 16 pages of ones and zeros, had no idea what it was, and promptly forgot about it for the best part of 30 years. And it was only rediscovered by accident when he was leafing through his old book, which he had kept, just rough notes, because he had made a sketch of the UFO in it.
Mm-hmm.
And as he was thumbing through it, that's the sketch of the UFO. This landed in Rendlesham Forest in the UK, December 1980, next to the 2 US military bases at Bentwaters and Woodbridge. And it was actually Linda Moulton Howe who happened to catch sight of these ones and zeros as he was trying to find this sketch, because he was doing a TV show on this. And Linda said, "Hey, what are those ones and zeros?" And Jim looked a bit sheepish and said, "Oh, that's the message." And so that whole story had just been buried for 30 years. And of course, then this was for an early episode of Ancient Aliens, actually. I think it was season 1 or season 2. They did a show on the 30th anniversary of Rendlesham, and they brought a lot of the people back to the site, and we filmed in the forest, for example. And then they got a computer programmer called Nick Sisk, who was familiar with binary code. And they said, well, look, ones and zeros, could that be binary? And Nick Sisk did a sort of decoding of this from binary to English language and came up with what's now, I guess, known as the Rendlesham message.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, and I haven't got it in front of me.
I have it.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Here's what it says, and I'll put a visual on the screen so y'all can see it. So the translation is as follows: exploration of humanity, continuous for planetary advance, eyes of your eyes, and origin year 8100. Nick Pope.
Yes. Well, of course, going back to what we were talking about with this Harvard study about
There we go.
other potential solutions to the UFO mystery. What if it's not extraterrestrial? What if it's not interdimensional? What if it's intertemporal? And so some people have speculated, particularly with this origin year 8100, are we talking about time travelers from the future?
Exactly.
It was a very niche theory until a very interesting character who I don't think I've not met, and he had I think has no interest in UAP, but there is a theoretical physicist called Ronald Mallet, and he's one of the very few physicists doing hands-on research into time travel. And he speculated and has published to the effect that if you ever developed time travel and wanted to send a message, you would do it with subatomic particles that have a spin of, and I'm way outside my area of expertise here, but some subatomic particles have a spin state of either up or down. And he said if you could effectively just manipulate that, you could send a message back in time. Well, Jim has no knowledge of theoretical physics. Jim had not heard of Ronald Mallet, and I don't think Ronald Mallet had heard of Jim Penniston. I'm not sure that they're connected even now. But the moment I saw that Ronald Mallet had published this, I had one of those aha moments. And I thought, well, here's the only theoretical physicist actually, or one of the very few, doing published work on time travel. And what's he talking about? Something that ties directly in with perhaps what happened to Jim Penniston. So again, I look for those connections.
Absolutely. And you're doing a good job. As a matter of fact, the name does ring a bell. And if I'm not mistaken, Professor Mallet is from Yukon, if I'm not mistaken. He's an African-American gentleman.
He is.
Yeah,
and
I know
think,
what you're talking about.
A while ago, I'm trying to think who the actor was. Maybe it's Lawrence Fishburne. Was now another interesting. My goodness, these connections are all over the place. A while ago, Lawrence Fishburne was involved in a potential optioning of the Rendlesham Forest story, and he wanted to play Charles Holt, not Jim Penniston. He wanted to play Charles Holt, and I can't remember what the production company and the studio was. And like 99% of all these projects, it's probably still in development hell. But Lawrence Fishburne was going to play Charles Holt. I think he was also going to play Ronald Mallet in a film version of Ronald Mallet's story, because Mallet's story is interesting. He was really badly hit by the death of his father when he was a child. And instead of going down the sort of religious route of saying, well, I'll see him again when I die, went down the scientific route of what if I could invent a time machine, and became a theoretical physicist. So a very interesting story. And yeah.
Wow. Thank you for that backstory. That I did not know. But the name, for some reason, it stuck with me because, and I believe he has done a couple of episodes of Ancient Aliens, if not my show. May have been Proof is out there. I'm not sure. But he's a brilliant gentleman.
Yeah, he's done a couple of TV shows. But the last thing I heard, there was talk of making his life story into this film or TV miniseries with, I think, Lauren Fishburne involved. But I might be misremembering some of the details.
I love the way you put development hell. We won't give too many of the behind the scenes secrets of network television. There's no such thing. They're really, speed to market. Okay. Yeah. Oh, wow. That's really cool. That's really cool. Well, listen, we've touched on so much. This has been great. We've talked about what's going on with these hearings, and I really respect all that you've said, and it's justified as to why they're taking this nuts and bolts approach. And yet this little non-nuts and bolts side of it is managing to leak in. Listen, are you hearing any rumblings? Give us the download or the down low. Any rumblings of what's coming up next? What do you think, we're going to have another watershed moment soon?
Yes, a few things to watch for. Volume 2 of Arrow's Historic Record Review will drop fairly shortly, I believe. I think it's actually overdue. It like Volume 1, will be very skeptical, but it will be another milestone in this, so it will be important. But I think one of the other things to watch for, three related things. Firstly, more congressional hearings, possibly as soon as this summer. I know that Representatives Burchett and Luna have talked about this, so expect the House Oversight Committee to be at the forefront of this, but there may be other committees, and it may be the Senate and not just the House. So that's something to watch for. There is already a debate about what UAP-related provisions are going to go into the 2025 National Defense Authorization Act. We have provisions, of course, in the 2024 Act. We had the Schumer-Rounds amendment, that got watered down and pretty much stripped out last time round. There are maybe some attempts to try and resurrect some of that language, get more whistleblower protections, for example. So that's something. But the big thing to watch for is whether this is going to become an issue in the presidential debate. Now, some people have already talked about might there be a UAP question in one of the debates. I don't know about that. I don't know whether this will be a factor, whether it would help or hinder either candidate. I don't really know where both candidates stand on this, but it's something to watch.
That'd be interesting. It's not the first time, if it did come up, Nick, if I recall, in past presidential debates over the years, I don't think it would be the first time for it to come up. And yet the tenor may be a bit different this time around.
Yes, it came up very famously, or should I say infamously, in one of the debates where the Democrats were trying to figure out who their candidate was going to be. And I remember that Dennis Kucinich was asked about his UFO sighting with Shirley MacLaine. And it was an ambush question, and it was asked in such a way as to basically ridicule him. And a lot of people said that was the death knell of his run to seek the nomination. I think we've moved on since then, but it still remains to be seen whether it will be a question, and if it is, whether the candidates play it for laughs or whether they play it straight. If they play it straight, they usually play it as a freedom of information question. And they say, well, if elected, I will do my best to bring out this information because the American people have a right to know. And that generally plays well.
Mm-hmm. Be interesting to see. FOIAs abound. Yeah, well, that's a whole other conversation. Perhaps it's a cliffhanger. Maybe you'll come back before they're debating, as we're recording this on today's the 24th, I believe. I think there's a debate this Thursday coming up, first one. So
Yes.
You never know. If you listen in, whoever's putting those questions together, you might want to slip that question in. So, what do you have coming up next before we go next door over to Patreon and continue the conversation? Tell us where we can find you. Tell us what's coming up next. Ancient Aliens Live.
Sure.
What's next?
Well, my website is nickpope.net, and my X, formerly known as Twitter handle, is at nickpopemod for Ministry of Defense. So at nickpopemod. Ancient Aliens Live is, as I say, taking a little summer break, but we already have 11, I believe, shows scheduled for the fall, and hopefully more to announce shortly. The website for that is ancientalienslivetour.com. And we've I think done around 60 shows over the last 2 years. We've toured all around the United States, and people love it. I mean, the passion and enthusiasm of the audience is just amazing, and we love going on the road and bringing a show that talks not only about the ancient mysteries, but also brings it up to date with some of the more modern UAP related material.
That's great. Well, I know they love seeing you and the gang, and we thank you so much for that's a pretty heavy schedule. Not pretty, it's very heavy. And you still managed to come to other events like Contact in the Desert, which we had a great time, didn't we, Nick?
We did, yes, absolutely. And obviously the legendary Sunday night Italian meal that you always organize is a part of that story.
That was so much fun. So much fun. Shout out to Castillo's in Palm Springs. Y'all really know how to do your dinner. So yeah, great. Thank you, Nick. Listen, don't go away. We're going to go right next door. We're going to keep it rolling. Guys, again, we're going to be talking about, we're going to take it in a slightly different direction, talking about the possibility of sentient AI, self-learning and beyond. I've got a couple stories, by the way, I'm going to share, and you can only get it over there. And we're also going to be talking about this idea of sentient craft. There have been, again, Nick, lots of anecdotes, lots of stories about people who believe that they were not necessarily in contact with the occupants, if there were any, but the craft itself. So that's what we're getting ready to do right now. But for now, Nick, again, thank you. This is just a great treat to finally have you on Higher Journeys. So I appreciate your time, and continued Godspeed to you.
Thanks, Alexis, and I'll see you in the after show.
Sounds great. Thank you, everyone. We will talk to you real soon, if not even sooner, next door. Thanks for watching. Take care.